The Porsche 918 Spyder, one of my favorite supercars. Sure, it's $2 million, there's only 918 of them, and it had state-of-the-art technology, but to me, it's a supercar. That probably made everybody watching pretty angry. I know that because saying it made me angry. Everyone who knows the 918 to any extent can tell you with 100% certainty that it's a hypercar. One of the best hypercars ever, in fact. So why did I call it a supercar? First off, I need to make it clear that I don't actually think that. I would call the 918 a hypercar, not a supercar, but if anyone does ever call it a supercar, you can't tell them they're wrong. I mean, you could, and maybe you should because their judgment of cars might be a little bit off, but my point is that supercar and hypercar are terms that have no concrete definition. Sure, if you take a low-end supercar and a high-end hypercar, you'll be able to tell the difference in almost any aspect right away, but if you take a low-end hypercar and a high-end supercar, the line becomes blurry. There's no exact rule set to determine a car's type, so anybody can call any car anything. Car manufacturers often apply labels like supercar or hypercar themselves, so it would be easy to just go off of what they say, but the thing is, they don't have a universal rule set either, so if they wanted to, they could call all of their cars hypercars, even if nobody else agrees. For that reason, I don't think it's always reliable to just take what they say as a fact. Sometimes it's helpful, but still. Both super and hypercars are types of sports cars. At least some people think that. Some people also say that sports cars are instead a tier below supercars. It's hard to say anything for sure because, again, these terms aren't defined very well. But I'm gonna go with the concept that sports cars are the overall type, while supercars and hypercars are different subcategories within it. If you don't agree, remember that's valid, I'm just going with my personal favorite idea. And feel free to leave a hate comment, just don't use too much profanity because then YouTube could flag it and I might not see it. Something I think it's important to mention, just to put it all in perspective, is that hypercars are a surprisingly recent thing. Not to sound like a broken record, but remember this is all subjective. So when I tell you that the first supercar was the Lamborghini Miura in 1966 and you don't agree, that's fine. We're both correct. If everyone voted on it though, the Miura would probably take the title as the first supercar because that's a popular choice. The first hypercar, however, didn't come around until at least 30-ish years later. At least that's the most common consensus. Some people say the 1954 300 SL Gullwing, but I personally don't think a car from that long before the term hypercar was even coined counts. What I would say the first hypercars would be the McLaren F1, Jaguar XJ220, Bugatti Veyron, and so on. There's obviously a lot of cars you could consider, but I don't have all day. Actually, I do. I do have all day. All of these cars had immaculate performance, especially for their time, and limited units. Most people agree that one of the biggest aspects of a hypercar is the number of units produced. Honestly, it might have more of an influence on a car's category than the performance. That's not to say that if I build 2 units of a car with a 50cc naturally aspirated inline that it's a hypercar, so performance still matters a lot, but it's nothing without exclusivity. Let's take 3 of the most famous hypercars, the Holy Trinity. There were 375 units of the McLaren P1 produced, 918 of the Porsche 918, and 500 of the Ferrari F70. Yeah, I'm pretty cool. I call the LaFerrari the F70. I'll sign autographs if you want. Those all have really good performance, but their title of the Holy Trinity is definitely aided by the amounts of unit, or rather the lack thereof. Now let's take a car that pretty much everyone considers a supercar, the Lamborghini Huracan. I'm gonna give you a second to take a guess as to how many units were produced over its 10-year run. Well, I don't know what you guessed, but hopefully it was like a million or 2, because the answer is 20,000, and that would mean you were wrong. Obviously, that's nowhere near the amount of Corollas that were produced, for example, which is like 50 million, but it's a good 20 to 60 times the amount of units your average hypercar has. The Ferrari SF90 is a car that most people consider a supercar, but you also have a fair amount of people who call it a hypercar. Comparing it to the LaFerrari, which yes is a few years older, but the comparison should still work, the SF90 has more horsepower and a quicker 0 to 60. That might be in part because of its electric motors, but the LaFerrari has those too, so you know, whatever, doesn't matter. Point is, the factors that differentiate the SF90 as a supposed supercar and the LaFerrari as a hypercar are the amount of units and the price, which I haven't talked about yet, yet, but I'm sure you thought of it anyways. That being said, the SF90 only had 1,398 units produced, which is significantly lower than the amount of your average supercar. So that leaves us with a question. At what point is a car's unit amount low enough to be a hypercar? The SF90 has the performance of what could be a low-end hypercar, but is 1,398 units really too many? The 918 had 500 units less, which is a decent amount, but it's not that big of a difference. I can't really completely answer this because, as you know by now, this is all subjective, but I'll do my best to answer in a little bit. If you have an opinion on the topic, comment it. I'm curious to see everyone's take. Quick interruption, if you enjoyed this poorly worded rant-like video, please consider subscribing. Because at 8,000 subscribers, I'll buy a Ferrari. Yeah, I'll buy a Ferrari. Anyways, if not the unit amount, the price of the SF90 could be the defining factor between super and hypercar. It was originally sold for 600,000 to 700,000. God damn it. In today's day and age, I can't be saying 6 to 7. Anyways, most hypercars are like $1 million and above, I would say, but the difference between 700,000 and $1 million isn't that much. For me at least, because I'm so rich. So again, I have to ask, at what price does a car go from super to hyper? What I do know is that the SF90XX, the track version, is probably a hypercar. It's got a little more horsepower, only 599 units, which is actually included in the 1,398 from a minute ago, and it was originally around 900,000 to $1 million. It's definitely a different car, but it's not that different. So hey, it just proves the point that the line between supercar and hypercar is very gray. Here's what I would say. There's 3 factors that decide if a sports car is a hypercar or a supercar. The first one is performance. I can't just say it has to have a certain amount of horsepower or a certain power to weight ratio or a certain track time, because those can't all individually decide a car's performance level, and it would have to change like every year because of how quickly performance stats advance. The McLaren F1 has 300 less horsepower than the P1, which has 300 less horsepower than the W1, and they're all hypercars. The power difference just has to do with the age. Since there's no reliable way to say specific performance stats, I would say a hypercar just has to have the top 5% performance or so out of any sports car. What exactly that means, I don't know. The second factor is price. I think that the cutoff for price would have to be around $950,000 in today's money. USD, by the way. I'm American if you couldn't tell. That's not to say a car that's $850,000 couldn't be a hypercar, but it starts to get a little harder to consider it one. You can probably tell that I'm having trouble deciding what's what for each of these categories because I keep going back on my word, but hey, it's not an easy question. And I promise this is the last time I'll say it, but this is all subjective. If you have a performance car that's $3 million out of the factory, then I would say it's almost certainly a hypercar, unless it's some gimmick that made it so expensive. If you have a car that's $200,000 but it performs better than a P1, maybe it's just a really good supercar. The last factor is, you guessed it, production units. Honestly, this might be one of the easiest to decide. I'm gonna say that the cutoff is 1,000 units. If a car has more than 1,000 units, then it's not exclusive enough to be a hypercar. Of course, 1,001 is probably fine, but the 1,000 cutoff is more of a guideline, not an exact number. I say 1,000 because of the 918, which is definitely a hypercar, and I wouldn't want to make that above the cutoff, so I think 1,000 is a good number. By the way, there's a thing called a megacar, which is a car that produces at least 1 megawatt of power, or 1,341 horsepower, that Koenigsegg invented. It's definitely interesting because it has a specific definition, but that also means it can't evolve with car advancements, so it's going to be a lot less impressive in the future. I would say that it's just a subcategory of hypercar though, so I'm not really going to talk about it. I just wanted to mention it because it's interesting. Maybe there should be a new term that applies to any car that's in between super and hypercar. That wouldn't really solve the problem because then there would just be 2 more gray areas on the end of it, but I still think it would be useful. I tried to come up with a cool name for this new category, but I couldn't really come up with anything good. I thought of ultra car, but then I thought that ultra seemed like a step above hypercar instead of below, and then I ended up on prime car, and that seems about right, but maybe it sounds kind of stupid. I don't know. Let me know if you have any good names. Anyways, that would make the car type tree for performance cars go like this, according to my opinion. As always, let me know your opinion in the comment, and thanks for watching, and subscribe if you enjoyed, or if you didn't. If you want to subscribe even though you didn't enjoy, that's fine with me. I'm okay with that.